In this video, an atheist student asks a tough question on the problem of evil. First, Dr. William Lane Craig will give an answer, and the next video will be another from Dr. Frank Turek. I will leave my thoughts at the end of the video. Let's check it out.
Epicurus' argument that if God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, if he knows about kids in Africa and that are born with AIDS, what do you think about him suggesting, him not intervening and him not changing that fact? That's a question that I've always struggled with. So I'm just wondering, could you expand on that? And I'd also like your input on it.
The problem of evil and suffering has been greatly discussed by philosophers, and I think there's been genuine progress made in this century on this problem. I think it's important to distinguish between the intellectual problem of suffering and the emotional problem of suffering, because these are quite different from each other. In terms of the intellectual problem of suffering, I think that you need to ask yourself, is the atheist claiming, as Epicurus did, that the existence of God is logically incompatible with the evil and suffering in the world? If that's what the atheist is claiming, then he's got to be presupposing some kind of hidden assumptions that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit, because these statements are not explicitly contradictory. The problem is no philosopher in the history of the world has ever been able to identify what those hidden assumptions would be that would bring out the contradiction and make it explicit. On the contrary, you can actually prove that these are logically compatible with each other by adding a third proposition, namely that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. As long as that statement is even possibly true, it proves that there's no logical incompatibility between God and the suffering in the world. So the atheist would have to show that it is logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, and no atheist has ever been able to do that. So the logical version of this problem, I think, is widely recognized to have failed. Those atheists who still press the problem, therefore press it as a probabilistic argument. They try to say that given the evil in the world, it's improbable that God exists. Not impossible, but improbable. Well, again, the difficulty there is that the atheist has to claim that if God did exist, then it is improbable that he would permit the evil and suffering in the world. And how could the atheist possibly know that? How could the atheist know that God would not, if he existed, permit the evil and suffering in the world? Maybe he's got good reasons for it. Maybe, like in Christian theism, God's purpose for human history is to bring the maximum number of people freely into his kingdom to find salvation and eternal life. And how do we know that that wouldn't require a world that is simply suffused with natural and moral suffering? It might be that only in a world like that the maximal number of people would freely come to know God and find salvation. So the atheist would have to show that there is a possible world that's feasible for God, which God could have created, that would have just as much salvation and eternal life and knowledge of God as the actual world, but with less suffering. And how could the atheist prove such a thing? It's sheer speculation. So the problem is that as an argument, the problem of evil makes probability judgments which are very, very ambitious and which we are simply not in a position to make with any kind of confidence. Now, I recognize that that philosophical response to the question doesn't deal with the emotional problem of evil. And I think for most people, this isn't really a philosophical problem. It's an emotional problem. They just don't like a God who would permit suffering and pain in the world. And so they turn their backs on him. What does Christianity have to say to this problem? Well, I think it has a lot to say. It tells us that God is not some sort of an impersonal ground of being or an indifferent tyrant who folds his arms and watches the world suffer. Rather, he is a God who enters into human history in the person of Jesus Christ. And what does he do? He suffers. On the cross, Christ bore a suffering of which we can form no conception. Even though he was innocent, he bore the penalty of the sins of the whole world. None of us can comprehend what he suffered. And I think when we contemplate the cross of Christ and his love for us and what he was willing to undergo for us, it puts the problem of suffering in an entirely different perspective. It means, I think, that we can bear the suffering that God calls upon us to endure in this life with courage and with optimism for an eternal life of unending joy beyond the grave because of what Christ has done for us. And he will give us, I think, the courage and the strength to get through the suffering that God calls upon us to bear in this life. So whether it's an emotional issue or an intellectual issue, I think ultimately Christian theism can make sense out of the suffering and evil in the world.
When somebody asks, why does God let babies die, for example, I'll say, I know why God allows babies to die in general, because we live in a fallen world. I mean, imagine if everyone lived till 70 years old. You were indestructible till you were 70. Would that change the way we lived? Yeah, totally. We would probably just live for ourselves until 69 and a half, and then maybe figure out, I notice people are starting to drop at 70. I better do something, you know. So we do live in a fallen world. But if you're going to ask me, why did God allow that baby to die? I don't know why, but I know why I don't know why. I'm stuck in time, but God can see the end from the beginning. There's something known as the ripple effect. And the ripple effect says that everything that happens ripples forward into the future to affect trillions of other events and billions of people. Maybe a baby dying today ripples forward into the future through a series of causes that helps bring forth the great evangelist 500 years from now who saves millions of people. Can we trace all those ripples ourselves? No, we can't, but God can. In fact, we see this ripple effect in a short story in the Old Testament with Joseph and his brothers, right? Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, and long story short, after he goes through a lot of pain and suffering in Egypt, he rises to the third highest administrator there. He puts a bunch of grain aside because he thinks a famine may come, and a famine does come, and then his own family that sold him into slavery leave Israel to come to Egypt to escape the famine, and as soon as Joseph sees them, he's in a position of power, he can help them or he can slam them. What does he say to them? He says, you dirty rats, you're going to pay for what you did to me. No, he doesn't say that. He says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, the saving of many lives. Here's a situation where the evil done by the perpetrator ripples forward to help them later. You can see it in the story. Most of the time we can't see the ripple effect, but there you can. This is why we can trust God. We know we're not promised 80 years of health. People die and get sick all the time. What we are promised is that things are going to work together for good to those that love God and are called according to his purpose.
Yes.
To add to Dr. William Lane Craig's answer, the stance of Christopher Hitchens and other famous atheists, if taken to its logical conclusion, is very obvious. And to speak that, I think C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist and later became a theist and an apologist, said it best in his book Mere Christianity, quote, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust?" End quote. Which is to say, evil is a privation or lack in a good thing. It does not exist on its own, but it exists as a lack in a good thing. So, in the final analysis, someone with an atheistic worldview will have to account for the entrance of evil and the existence of good as an immaterial virtue without an author of goodness. And logically, there's no way to describe an immaterial virtue like goodness in a materialistic way. So to be logically consistent, some posits that there's no such thing as evil or good, just personal preferences, which is a radical manifestation of the violation of one's conscience. So evil doesn't necessarily disprove the existence of God, but becomes an argument for the existence of God, not one against the existence of God. And I think Dr. Frank Turek did a great job with his response too. Feel free to share your thoughts on this, and see you in the next video.